computer. So if some of you read the email that we sent out or the post that we had promoting this meeting, it was labeled "All We Want Is Justice." So, and one of the things that I brought up in the email was the fact that there was two major marches that originated in South Texas and traveled through San Juan, which is where LUPE is currently headquartered, before they traveled up the state over 400 miles to the state capital, which is in Austin. We will only get to talk about the first march, which is the one that happened in 1966 and started in Rio Grande City. Hold on, let me admit somebody in here. So we're gonna go ahead and talk about the first march then from 1966. We don't have time to talk about the March for Human Rights that happened in 1977. That one was started by the Texas Farm Workers Union, and that one, not only did they march to Austin, but they actually marched all the way to Washington, D.C. and the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. But that's a story for another day. We're going to be talking about the first march that happened in 1966 today. So where did it happen? Like I mentioned, it happened in Starr County in Rio Grande City. And you probably are looking at these pictures and seeing some hills in the bottom picture, and you're like, that's not the valley. And for the longest time, I would have agreed with you, but I have more recently traveled more to Rio Grande City, and it's amazing the transformation that you can see from traveling from South Padre Island or Brownsville from the beach, traveling through the Mid-Valley, and then going all the way to Starr County, and the change of topography and just the amazing views that you can see. But just to establish where this story took place, it started off in Starr County in 1966. And why did this march start? It's pretty simple. You know, the workers were being exploited. They're being exploited by mainly these I was going to say multinational, but at the time they were not multinational. These corporate farms that were multi-million farms that were paying workers anywhere from 40 to 86 cents or 85 cents per hour. And at the time, I believe the minimum wage was $1.25. So they were trying to get the minimum wage of $1.25, and they were only getting paid 40 cents to 85 cents. And just to put that into perspective, the minimum wage of $1.25, if it were to be fixed for inflation, would actually be $10.95. So back then in 1966, $1.25 an hour would actually be, in today's money, $10.95 an hour. So it's even more than our current minimum wage. Would anybody like to guess what our current minimum wage would be in 1966 wages? You can put it in the chat, or if you'd like to take it off yourself.
Isn't the current minimum wage like $7.35 right now in Texas?
Mm-hmm. I think it's $7.25 or $7.50.
So that'd probably be like $25 back then, right? Something like that.
I think I did the math earlier, and it was 85 to 86 cents an hour. So roughly what these workers were already getting paid is what our minimum wage is now, right? So they were being exploited then, and it kind of tells a story about our current minimum wage and how it might be just as exploitative now, right? When you have corporations and these businesses recording record profits while the minimum wage has not gone up. So So just to go a little bit more, into detail, the strike was not just about better wages, but it was, about better living conditions. At the time, a third of the 3,339 people that lived in Starr County made less than $1,000 a year, and 70% were considered poverty stricken, So this was a place where people were exploited. And these farms that we're going to see right now were making millions of dollars, a year. But before we get into that, we got to talk. Before we talk about the villains in the story, we got to talk about the heroes, right? So the heroes of the story, of course, the Starr County farm workers. We have here a picture of the first rally that was documented by the UFW in Rio Grande City, where you can see some of the Starr County farm workers. On the right-hand corner, you see Domingo Arredondo, and he was the chairman and local leader for the strikers. Under that, on the bottom left-hand corner, you have Librado de la Cruz. In the picture, he was 27 years old, and he was the person who was arrested the most times while the strike was going on. He was arrested 7 times. And you can see by his sign that, he wanted to make sure that people receive decent wages. Not much has changed, because today we're still fighting for those decent wages, not just for farm workers, but for everybody. And then in the middle picture, you see the women. That's Gabriela Rosa, Emma Lanis, and Sebastiana Lopez. So a lot of these farm workers and shed workers were not just men, they were also women, they were children, right? And then probably the person who gets the most credit is Eugene Nelson. So Eugene Nelson was working for the UFW at the time. He had led or helped in the campaign in California with the grapes. So he had the experience of working with farm workers in California, and he came down to Texas, first to San Juan, where he was talking to farm workers there. And then those farm workers were like, you need to go to Rio Grande City. And so he went to Rio Grande City, and within the first day that he went, they held a meeting where hundreds of farm workers showed up, and they were ready, right? They were ready to fight for their rights. And just to let everybody know, I'm getting all this information. This is being sourced by Sons of Zapata, which was published in 1967 by the UFW, telling the story of the melon strike that happened in Rio Grande City. And I'll go ahead and share that publication with y'all after up in a follow-up email as well. So the villains, or some of the villains in the story, were the 5 major growers in Starr County, which include La Casita Farms, Griffin Brand or Trophy Farms, Starr Farms, Los Puertos Plantations, Sun Farms, Margot Farms. So they still use the word plantations because that's where they were, right? They were taking advantage of these workers that were getting paid 40 cents an hour. And some of these farms, like La Casita Farms, were making over $1 million a year. It said that even in the year of the strike, these farms were able to make over $5 million, a year. So imagine, so we talked earlier about how $1.25 back then equaled $10.95 in 2022. Imagine what $1 million back then would be, compared to today. So they were making a lot of money and taking advantage of the workers. And the workers knew this, so they didn't want to just let it continue happening. But the farmers had some help, right? They had the political machine and the politicians that sided with them. Included here in the pictures on the left-hand side, you can see Randall Nye. He was the county prosecutor for Starr County and also one of the attorneys for one of the farms. So no conflict of interest there, right? And then on the right-hand side, you have Deputy Roberto Peña. He was the deputy sheriff, and he participated in dozens of arrests of union members. And they used to trump up charges and have people arrested so that they can, they have to pay fines, and it's a way of oppressing people. And then the ranger was Jerome Prius, I believe is the way his name was pronounced. He was the first rinche, which is a slang term for Texas Rangers that was created at the time, a rinche. He was the first Texas Ranger that came down. He came down on the first day of the strike and immediately arrested Eugene Nelson, right? So he saw who was riling people up and originally arrested him. And Eugene Nelson was arrested a couple times, but that's kind of how it goes, right? When you're questioning power, power does not like that. So those were some of the villains in the story. But so now that we know where and who was a part of the story, what exactly happened, right? So even though they started the strike in 1966, they were able to still continue the harvest, whether by bringing in workers from Mexico or finding ways to do the work. There's actually this story about lawyers and business owners and their wives going to work at these packing sheds that were on strike, where the workers went on strike, and how these people from the town that wanted to show that they could also do the work, and within hours their hands were bleeding and they just could not handle the work, and went on strike just the same, because they realized that this wasn't worth what they were putting themselves through. But unfortunately, when you're poor, you don't have that advantage, right? Even though you're being exploited at your job site, that doesn't mean you can necessarily walk away, especially because you as one individual don't have the power. But when we come together, across differences, that's when we're really able to show the power that we have. And that's what happened, with this marcha. So the harvest ended without the strike ending. So in 1966, the strike ended, but the farmers were not budging. They were not going to give the workers any raises. They actually started treating them even worse, and using law enforcement as a way to treat them worse. So that's when they decided to take a pilgrimage towards Austin, similar to the march to Sacramento that the UFW did from Delano, California. So, and other civil rights leaders were doing at the time. So they took inspiration from these other civil rights fighters that were coming together to make a difference. So throughout the journey, they actually started in Rio Grande City and then marched all the way to San Juan, to the Basilica of San Juan, where they received blessing from the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church at the time was actually helping the strikers by providing them donations, food donations, clothes donations. So the church and these strikers were working together, or the church was supporting these workers. So that's one of the reasons why they went to San Juan, but also because they started gathering more workers, right? It wasn't just about Starr County and the farm workers that were being exploited there. This was happening throughout Texas, if not, most of the United States at the time. And this was an opportunity for them to come together and join. In the pictures, you can see the farm workers taking a break in between their march. In the bottom picture, you can see Tomas Mojarado. She was the one of the few members that actually marched the entire 490 miles to Austin. You know, so she was a cook, and she assistant cook on the strike kitchen, and was part of the entire march, which is pretty amazing. I can't see myself walking 490 miles, but maybe that's something we need to do in order to bring more attention to what's going on. I know right now. I know that when this was happening um, that this was a big issue, not only for the farm workers in Stark County, but they were also able to get other farm workers to join them from other unions, from religious leaders. So here are a couple more pictures of them as they're traveling and marching up to Austin. And I don't know how familiar some of y'all are with Chicano history and local Rio Grande history, but on one of these pictures down here at the bottom, you can see Dr. Hector P. Garcia in the picture that says "All we want is justice." Dr. Hector P. Garcia is a started the American GI Forum, which was an organization that was pushing for veterans to be treated equally after I believe it was after the war. After they came back, they were fighting for freedom across seas, but then when they came back, they were still facing discrimination. So there was leaders not only from Stark County, but there was leaders coming together and people that were already fighting discrimination that saw this as an opportunity to join hands and bring attention to all the injustices that were happening, right? So just to continue here, the marcha ended on Labor Day in 1966. So when they got to Austin, over 15,000 people joined that final day. So they made their way up to Corpus Christi, then San Antonio, and then eventually they got to Austin. Something that we do have to talk about is that the march did not win them any contracts, or it didn't even mean that the passage of $1.25 minimum wage happened. So this was a movement that kind of brought national attention to what was going on in Texas, but it also brought local attention to other farmers or farm workers that were being exploited. And it's credited by the UFW as being this moment in Chicano rights movement where it showed the power that we have, and it inspired more people to participate in actions that pushed for justice and equality. So after the Austin March, the strikers had to come back to Starr County, right? So the strike continued. They still hadn't received the minimum wage. They still hadn't received contracts to bargain the working conditions. This is all important, right? Because sometimes people think, oh, well, we're just going to march and we're going to create change. And oftentimes that's not how change happens, right? So even though they traveled those 490 miles to Austin, it didn't immediately cause the change they wanted. It actually caused a little bit of a different change. So the governor actually requested more Texas Rangers to go to Stark County, right? To put these strikers in jail and to let them know that they're the ones that held the power and not the people, right? So that's why you see these signs that say "Down with the Texas Gestapo," right? Or they're the "We Mexicans are tired and we've had it and we want justice," right? That's the way they were being treated. They were being treated as they had no rights, and it was police and political persons in political power that were using that power to keep the profits with the people on top and not share that with the workers. So part of the strike was also importing strike breakers from Mexico. And on the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the picture of the bus as they're picking up and dropping off workers from Mexico that were getting paid way less, and were willing to work for those 40 cents an hour, right? So like I mentioned, there were more arrests and beatings. One of the biggest beatings that happened on the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the picture of Magdaleno Dimas. He was beat by the Texas Rangers to the point where he had permanent damage, and they actually wrote a song after what happened to him. It's called Los Rinches del Sur, and it kind of tells the story of how he was beat by the Texas Rangers, and kind of why, and talks about the melon strike and its importance. Another instance that happened after the march was the showdown at Roma, where Eugene Nelson, Antonia Rondine, and another worker were arrested by blocking the bridge. So they saw that the farm workers from Mexico were making it hard for the strike to continue because they were bringing in workers. So they decided, to do what a lot of movements that do today, which is stop the flow of traffic and goods, and use that as a way to create an action where people can feel it, especially those people that depend on the money being made. So yes, I will definitely share that link, Caitlin, if not in the chat, after the fact when I share the slide and the Sons of Zapata. But with time, there was some international solidarity. So what happened was that the strikers and the UFW workers were able to talk to those Mexican national workers, and more often than not, they sided with the strikers, right? So it made it harder and harder for these farms to continue using these workers from Mexico, to the point where even one instance, for a couple days, the unions in Mexico completely shut down the bridge as well, and there was no workers moving in between. But that only happened for a couple days because of powers that be that were able to use those powers to pressure the workers. But with that international solidarity also came the first contract that was signed. So one of the smaller farms decided to negotiate and sign a contract with the workers. So that was a step in the right direction, right? And most importantly, I think one of the biggest things that happened because of the movement and the marcha and the strike that was happening in Rio Grande City was a congressional hearing that happened here in Starr County, right? So these senators came down and interviewed the workers, the farm workers, and they documented in the national records everything that was going down. So with these testimonies that were heard at this congressional hearing, courts later were able to use these testimonies as a way to slowly but surely grant farm workers more rights. I was going to show this quick 4-minute video of interviews that were done with some of the workers, because it was interesting that it was done by a Texas historic organization, but there was some misinformation that was in this worker strike, which was it was a good example of how sometimes when we depend on like media or secondhand stories to tell us our history, that sometimes history changes along the way. So just to save time and give us more time for discussion, I'm going to go ahead and share this video with y'all after the fact. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording here, or stop the recording.